Hey everybody, welcome back to Soda Pop Culture. I'm Dr. Mosley, Professor Williamson here today. What are we talking about?
Today, we are going to talk about the influence of, in this case, hip hop, and how, which has been, obviously incredibly influential over the course of the last, I don't know, 3 decades, I suppose, going on 4. But
Or easily, yeah.
But in the context of a couple of brands and how, in the early sort of days of hip hop, it wasn't really the case that consumer brands sort of embrace the genre, and consumer brands typically aren't the first to do it, right? There has to be a bit of a proof of concept. There has to be a bit of a safety space for a lot of brands. But there were a couple of brands who, for their own reasons, and we'll talk about them, were a lot quicker to sort of embrace hip hop music. One of them, the Sprite brand, beverage brand, we'll talk about, that sort of noticed something in hip hop that would help resuscitate that brand. And then there's a more obscure brand called Mitchell and Ness, and Mitchell and Ness is a company out of Philadelphia that had for years had made vintage looking football, baseball, basketball jerseys. And so like guys like me could go and buy a jersey of an authentic materials and things made by Mitchell and Ness, honoring one of like our childhood heroes kind of thing. And how that middle-aged sort of white guy idea was adopted by hip hop music, and a lot of the early rappers and hip hop performers in the 80s and 90s started wearing these jerseys, and it introduced that whole brand, that Mitchell and Ness brand, to a huge audience that heretofore had never been exposed to it. So that's kind of what we're going to chat about today. So I'll be very interested in hearing what your own sort of recollections on those kind of things are. I'll throw up here can you see that?
Not yet.
Oh, no. Okay. Let me do my share screen. There it is. And let me just make it a little bigger for you so you can, now you can see it, right?
Yep.
So it might surprise our viewers to know that if you go back and look at the history of Sprite, it was always the point I've talked to some students about, which is uniformly surprising to them, right? Because they're young people, not old like me. Yeah. Is that Sprite is the #1 most requested beverage by moms or dads when they're buying a Happy Meal at McDonald's for their kids.
Yeah.
For a lot of basic sort of reasons, right? It doesn't have caffeine, which if you have children, you typically don't want them having too much caffeine. And it has this sort of halo, this perception of being sort of quote unquote better for you because it's clear, right? It has this, but primarily because of
those dyes and stuff
primarily because of the caffeine, right? It doesn't have caffeine in it. So Sprite had done really well over the course of its whole sort of life cycle as a no caffeine, refreshing beverage, but there was nothing that made it particularly special. It was in a very competitive category with 7-Up and some of the other lemon lime profile beverage brands. And the brand team decided that they needed to do something to re-engage a younger audience, right? So we knew that adults liked it as a mixer. We knew that adults liked buying it for their children because it didn't have caffeine. But that's typically not how you grow a brand. If you want to grow a brand, there's one specific demographic that you are most interested in. And I say this regardless of what the brand is, even if it's an adult brand. Every brand wants to know what 18 to 24-year-olds think about their brand. And in the context of something like Sprite, it would be even younger than that. It might be 13, 14, 15. Why? Because that's where brand loyalties are inspired and locked in, and the things that you love when you're a teenager, you typically will carry with you the rest of your life. So particularly when it comes to beverages. So Sprite did a lot of work and decided that they would embrace this this emerging musical genre called hip hop or rap in the early 90s, and was one of the first brands to do that. If you go back and look at the history of the Sprite brand and hip hop music, it goes all the way back to Curtis Blow, who was one of those original guys, you know, back in the 80s, and they started using you know, hip hop artists in their advertising, and it was a fascinating time because you had their primary sort of volume was still large 2-liter bottles for families and preferred beverage and Happy Meals for little kids.
Yeah.
And they were able, while doing that, to begin to build an authentic relationship in this emerging musical genre called hip hop, when essentially nobody else was. It's just it was an interesting time to be in that business, and a really interesting time to watch how, as that musical genre emerged, how Sprite sort of was reborn and became a really authentic player in that musical genre, such that you see the image there with Notorious B.I.G. that they were able to authentically become a partner with a lot of hip hop stars, such that it became sort of a badge for a lot of these performers that they knew they had arrived when they got a Sprite deal. You know, when they were in a Sprite commercial. Lots of people remember the Drake spot from, I guess, about 10 years or so ago now, where he drinks a Sprite in a recording studio and he comes apart and you see the Sprite running through his body, which is sort of an elaborate recording studio inside his physique, if you will. Just a really interesting sort of example of how a brand embraced an emerging pop culture phenomenon in the music world, and together they sort of wove this relationship that really helped, I think, both the musical genre and the Sprite brand itself. So what was the first, do you remember the first hip hop song that you remember hearing, or the one that sort of you liked the most?
Well, for me, it was probably like early LL Cool J. I mean, obviously like Sugar Hill Gang, and
Sure.
I mean Blondie technically, but you know, that early like LL, Mama Said Knock You Out, My Adidas, my, you know, NWA was big in South Dakota for some reason. You know, there was, I mean, the 80s was just like rife with like MTV had Yo MTV Raps. I don't know if you remember.
Oh yeah.
You know, but yeah, it's so all those other ones. I remember the Biggie versus Tupac debacle and all that stuff, and you know, I mean, Too Short, and I mean, I could kind of go on a little bit, but most of them don't have appropriate songs for this podcast.
and that's and of the many things I admire about you, Matthew, I mean, your deep sort of music, you know, musical knowledge, everything just incredible. So I knew that would spin off an interesting chat. You mentioned Sugar Hill Gang, and that's I told this story in class that in 1979, I think.
It was a while.
Yeah, I was a freshman in high school, and a friend of mine said, "You got to come over to the house. You got to see this album, and then you have to hear it." And it was Sugar Hill Gang, Rapper's Delight. I mean, not Rapper's Delight. It was
Rapper's Delight.
Rapper's Delight. And he pulled it out, and I'm looking at it, and it's one song, right? It's a 33 RPM, you know, LP, but it is one song. And I said, "What is this?" And he put it on, and I remember not sort of fully sort of understanding it, but I remember even as a 14-year-old or whatever I was at the time, 15, thinking, okay, this is really different, right? This is not like what I've heard before. I didn't know if I liked it or not at that point, but I was attuned enough to know this is different. This is very, very different than anything I've heard.
Well, I mean, I think before even Rapper's Delight, I think my first introduction to them was like White Lines.
Uh-huh.
I mean, but it was just completely different from all that other just straight up. I mean, people don't realize we just had to listen to the radio.
Right. Right.
So, I mean, wherever you're at, if you want to listen to music, I mean, you can have your cassettes, you know, or your vinyl records, which one behind you.
Right.
But you listen, most of your music was influenced by what you listened to in the car.
Sure.
Going to work or school or even on the bus. I remember they played the radio. Bad memories of Prince for some reason. I was sick that day and it stuck with me. I can't listen to Purple Rain anymore.
Oh wow.
But, yeah,
that's too bad because that's a great song.
Oh, it's a fantastic song. I got over it, but it took me like 10 years. And it's just, you know, that's the way culture was. If you had something on the radio, and Sugar Hill Gang got played.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And so there was that. I mean, and then what you said, you made reference to the album, to the record behind me, and what the Sprite brand was able to do, and then we can sort of pivot to Mitchell and Ness, which is a fascinating story. But what Sprite was able to do then is this is really important for brands, right? It's one thing to just sort of borrow the equity from a pop culture phenomenon like that. And if you do it the wrong way, it can be perceived as very sort of self-serving and cynical and kind of gratuitous. Right?
Kylie Jenner, Pepsi. What?
Kylie, that's a subject. Well, yes, that on a future podcast, we'll be talking about the Kylie Jenner PepsiCo ad, which did not go well for them.
What a disaster.
But, yeah, exactly. And that's one of the ones where it was like everything was done wrong. And you know, there were people in the room who were like, I don't know, guys, you know, but
well, that's what happens when you surround yourself with yes men.
Exactly. But what Sprite was able to do is, having established that authentically and taken some of the slings and arrows as a result of it, it was a genre of music, as you recall, which was not then, and in many cases is still not now, and with good reason sometimes, sort of embraced by the broader sort of culture because of the unique sort of issues and voice that these artists are lending to their own personal experience and some of the issues that they've been around or grown up in. Around.
Bad.
Oh, exactly.
I mean, like students now may not realize because it's so ingrained in all music, but hip hop and rap was considered a fad, and a fad typically burns out after a couple of years, like grunge.
Right.
But it evolved, it morphed. I mean, geez, we've seen all sorts of, you know, from the gangster rap and Two Live Crew and all sorts of stuff that definitely don't Google, right? Just
at least not under the explicit instructions of Matthew or Scott, right?
Yeah, you know, to, you know, all of a sudden the 90s where you had artists who had a broader appeal and everything else, and I mean, Missy Elliott and you know Puff Daddy and now is he P Diddy or
Diddy? I think it's
I don't know. I think anymore.
Right. You know, and all of it. So, and the album behind me is a good example. I'll see if I can grab it. Of sort of how that evolved. So what we ended up doing, this is an example of, and you would never have even envisioned something like of this happening in the late 80s, early 90s. This is a unique, a limited pressing on this Sprite green, this Coca-Cola green bottle vinyl of Public Enemy's "Fight the Power."
Yeah.
Not typically you would see a massive multi-billion-dollar commercial brand lending its name to a pressing of Public Enemy's "Fight the Power," which is a song, which is a protest song about fighting, you know, against the institutions of oppression as seen by those artists.
Yeah, it was a amazing choice because Coke is the establishment.
Right.
I mean, as far as like big beverage soda goes,
right,
you can't get much bigger than Coke.
Right. It is it is.
And then for them to choose Fight the Power, you know, I mean, I can just imagine like Flavor Flav and Chuck D cashing those checks like,
okay,
we're going to fight the powers that be.
Right.
You know?
And interestingly, and so this is, I'll get a close up. You see, it says remix.
Yeah.
Sprite remix, which is just quickly, it is both a, let me put this down first. It's actually a really good sort of way to put a bow on this conversation, because what the brand started to do was to, after it established that authenticity and had an authentic role in that music space over many, many years, decided to use hip hop music as a way to help launch new flavor extensions. And the way that they decided to do, I mean, Sprite Remix was Sprite with a little berry sort of flavor. And then there was a tropical remix, there was a berry remix. And whenever we would create a remix version of Sprite using the word remix, right, which is a hip hop term, a kind of blending together of two different kinds of music or a reinterpretation of something, it fit perfectly with Sprite and what Sprite was doing with a flavor, a new flavor profile, and tying it back to classic, a remix of or a reissue of a classic hip hop song like Public Enemy's "Fight the Power." So you can only do that when you've established that kind of authenticity within the space, or these guys aren't going to work with you and nobody's going to buy it and you're going to get mocked, right? So
yeah, I mean, it could go so wrongly if you don't do it right.
Correct.
Which
right.
is
Exactly.
Again, yeah.
So the other thing, I'm going to throw this picture up again, just so folks.
Oh, a throwback. All right.
Can see the nice. The picture in the up here of
Lil Wayne.
Lil Wayne, yeah, in his New Orleans Jazz Mitchell and Ness jersey, and that's a Mitchell and Ness sweatshirt over there.
And yes, it was the New Orleans Jazz, not the Utah Jazz.
Exactly,
makes more sense if you think about it. Anyway,
there
just like the LA Lakers,
exactly right.
Minnesota team,
right, exactly right. Lakers make sense in the context of Minnesota, land of 10,000 lakes. They don't really make sense for Los Angeles, where I don't know that there are lakes.
The all dried up.
And New Orleans Jazz makes sense because that, again, you know, for the people who are listening and watching this who aren't in their 40s, 50s, these sports teams, a lot of times they keep the name from where they originally were founded, New Orleans Jazz, which makes total sense, birthplace of jazz and all that. So this is an interesting case, though. This is a company, Mitchell and Ness, that was out of Philadelphia and became known over time as the place where you would go to buy vintage looking jerseys from professional teams of your youth, made with authentic materials. So you could buy a 1961 New York Yankees number 7 for Mickey Mantle jersey made just like the one that Mantle wore in 1961, of the same materials, gray, wool flannel or those types of things. Yeah. And that was their thing.
Not 100% sure I want like the old wool, but whatever. I mean,
I own a bunch of them just because.
Yeah, they look great. They look amazing.
Yeah, they do. Now, what happened was in Atlanta, and I remember this myself, in Atlanta in the early 90s, when Atlanta was one of the major sort of hubs for hip hop in the US. And there was a guy in, I think it was Lenox Mall, who had one of those, which is like one of the oldest malls in the South, and had one, remember the old days when you used to actually go to a mall and there were stores along the sides, and then there were these kiosks in the middle of the mall, right, for smaller businesses. They would sell smaller things, or they would, that sort of thing. There was a guy who started just selling these Mitchell and Ness classic, remake jerseys from all these teams. And just organically, a lot of the hip hop performers who were in Atlanta or performing in Atlanta or were from Atlanta started buying these jerseys, and they started to make requests of him. And this is the beauty of this genre of music, is they take something It's the beauty of popular culture when it happens organically, is they take something and they reinterpret it, or they do something differently with it. So you had this emerging sort of fashion culture of wearing Mitchell and Ness jerseys, not like old guys like me who remember Mantle in 1961, or the stories that my dad would tell me about him, but young people who would buy the jerseys and buy the oversized versions of them, right? So what began to emerge, you would start to see it in hip hop videos, were young, typically African American guys wearing 2XL, 3XL, 4XL, these big oversized jerseys from these players from other eras. And what it did was introduce these old Mitchell and Ness vintage style uniforms, jerseys, to a whole generation. And so hip hop began to sort of pick and choose in that powerful musical genre, the sort of the elements of past fashion and things that became very current and very sort of popular again, all because of this genre of music. Do you remember, like, when you first saw people walking around with these sort of large, sort of oversized jerseys and things?
Oh yeah, yeah. I was like, I mean, obviously I'm a fashion icon. Look at,
of course, well known here on campus for that.
It really is. I mean, my polo game is rock solid, but no, I do remember. And but the thing that I find most interesting about this is that if Mitchell and Ness tried
that's great
to do this,
right,
it would have failed.
Right.
It would have failed so hard. This
right.
is something that organically, and didn't they even try to fight it a little bit? Like, we don't make those.
Yeah.
We don't make that size.
That's not our, it's a great point. It's like, you never are ultimately successful as a consumer brand if you start telling people, no, we don't want to sell it to you. We don't want to do that. Right?
Yeah. I mean, this probably made them last 30 years longer.
Sure.
Easily.
Oh yeah.
Like, and look at our profits. They just skyrocketed. Fantastic.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think that it's, you hit on something really, really important. Like, sometimes you can identify a pop culture trend and work to sort of incorporate yourself in it authentically. Sometimes you just have to grab onto it when it happens to you, and ride it, right? And that's what they ultimately did. You're right. I mean, because you can imagine when that guy who's running the kiosk at the Lenox Mall, and he says, hey, listen, I'm starting to hear from some of my consumers that some of my buyers that they would like larger versions, and the Mitchell and Ness guys going, I'm not making a 3XL version of a Randy White Dallas Cowboys jersey from 1977. Who's going to buy that, right? So, but they were smart enough to do it ultimately, and became every bit as much part of the uniform, if you will, of hip hop as it emerged as a major genre of music, in the same way that Sprite did on the beverage side, right? In the same way that, and we'll talk about this in a future episode, in the same way that Adidas did, with hip hop. The power of hip hop to make or break brands for a incredibly diverse population of young people is really uncanny if you really explore it. And that's what this conversation in class was about, how Sprite and how Mitchell and Ness, both in their own way, were helped to promote and introduce, in the case of Sprite, a genre of music to people who might otherwise have never been exposed to it. And in the case of Mitchell and Ness, how hip hop resurrected and expanded and redefined a vintage sports jersey brand, in a way that you could never have anticipated it happening, or, to your point, planned it if you wanted to.
Well, yeah, and I mean, for the most part here, we got to tell two completely they're related, but they're not. Sprite thoughtfully went about and got lucky that they embraced it.
Oh yeah.
I mean, because if they hadn't embraced it,
when it got a little hot, particularly, when people started complaining and you said, nope, we're going to stick with this. We're not just going to back off.
Oh yeah. Cause I can imagine, I mean, all this South Dakota, I didn't see any of these commercials. I mean, which is fine.
Segmentation, right?
It's still crisp and, it's still crisp and refreshing.
Exactly right. Sure.
But again, I mean, it worked. And Mitchell Ness, when sometimes there's you see something going on, it's like, can I make money off this?
Right.
Is it gonna hurt my brand?
Right.
No, because the old white guys are still gonna want to buy your authentic jerseys, right? At whatever size they're wearing. Right. Doesn't hurt you to sell 2X, 3X, because guess what? A bunch of old white guys are that too.
That's right. Increasingly.
Yeah. Yeah. But no, this is fascinating.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
There's just, and I'm looking forward to the Adidas talk, because that one there, I mean, so many great examples.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about it. I mean, we just spent however long talking about hip hop and its influence on a beverage brand and on a vintage jersey brand. Hadn't even gotten into the conversation about that musical genre and sneakers.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
well, I mean, it used to be a whole uniform. I mean,
oh yeah, sure.
People, you could look back and you'd see groups like dressed up like they're going to go exercise.
Right.
No.
Right.
They're going to go rock the bells.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, that will be coming up, and I really enjoy this class because there are new ideas that sort of pop into our heads all the time about ways in which consumer brands influence popular culture and popular culture influences consumer brands, and Sprite and Mitchell and Ness and hip hop are just another great example.
Yeah. What's great is that the students probably have examples that we don't even know about. That's the one thing about that class. I mean, you probably hear stuff like, really? Dang. All right.
Right. Exactly. There's no shortage of content.
No. All right. Thank you so much, Scott.
Not a problem. Enjoyed it as always.
All right. Bye.
See ya.